The Pacific Ocean, sometime after dark on the 16th night. A rubber raft barely 4 feet wide and 8 feet long rises and falls on a black swell. 3 men lie inside it, pressed together for warmth, their skin already cracking from salt and sun. None of them has eaten a proper meal in over 2 weeks. None of them knows, within 300 miles, where they are. One of them is a radio man from a small town in Missouri named Gene Aldrich. He is 22 years old, and back home, according to the account his family gave many years later, his mother has already been handed a telegram from the Navy telling her that her son is lost at sea. She is right about one thing: he is lost. She is wrong about the thing that matters most. He is not dead. He is out here, alive, on a scrap of rubber, doing the one thing the United States Navy had never trained him to do, which is to survive with almost nothing. There is no patrol coming for him. There is no search plane overhead. In the opening weeks of 1942, the Navy that these men belonged to had no organized system for finding a lost aircrew in the open ocean. There were no dedicated rescue squadrons. There were no submarines waiting beneath the flight paths to pull downed flyers from the water. A carrier launched its planes, and if a plane did not come back, the fleet noted the loss and kept moving, because stopping to search would betray the position of the ships to enemy submarines. These 3 men had simply flown off the edge of the map. By every procedure the Navy had written down, they were gone. And then, more than a month after they vanished, they walked out of the sea onto a beach on the far side of the world, sunburned to the bone, starved down to little more than skeletons, alive. This is the story of how that happened. It is not a story about luck, although luck was in it. It is a story about a specific kind of human stubbornness, and about a navy that in 1942 had built some of the finest carrier aircraft afloat, but had not yet built the one thing that would have found these men in a single afternoon. That thing was coming. It arrived too late for them. They had to become their own rescue. To understand how close to impossible their survival was, you first have to take seriously how advanced the machine was that failed them, and how completely it failed. The aircraft these 3 men flew was a Douglas TBD Devastator, a carrier-based torpedo bomber. In the years just before the war, it had been a genuinely modern machine. When the prototype first flew in April of 1935, it marked a whole series of firsts for American naval aviation. It was among the first all-metal aircraft the Navy put on a carrier deck, at a time when much of the world's naval air power still flew fabric-covered biplanes. It carried a fully enclosed cockpit, a real novelty then, and it was the first Navy aircraft fitted with wings that folded by hydraulic power so that more of them could be packed onto a crowded hangar deck. Its landing gear was only semi-retractable, the wheels left deliberately protruding a few inches below the wing so that a pilot forced to land without lowering them would do less damage to the aircraft. On paper, in 1937, the Devastator was a serious machine. The 3 men inside it were not passengers. They were a trained crew, each with a defined job. The pilot was Chief Aviation Machinist's mate Harold Dixon, a man of about 40, and one of a rare breed in the Navy of that era. He was an enlisted pilot. He had not come to the cockpit through the officer academy at Annapolis. He had come up through the enlisted ranks and earned a place in flight training at Pensacola through the Naval Aviation Pilot Program, a small path that let a limited number of enlisted men fly the Navy's aircraft. Dixon had joined the Navy as a very young man around the end of the First World War, reportedly adjusting his age to get in, and by 1942 he had roughly 2 decades of sea time behind him. That experience would turn out to be the single most important asset the 3 of them possessed. That Dixon was an enlisted man in the cockpit at all is a small piece of naval history worth dwelling on. For most of its existence, the Navy reserved its aircraft for commissioned officers, but a limited program allowed a select few enlisted sailors, men who had proven themselves in the ranks, to earn their wings and fly. They were sometimes called flying chiefs, and they tended to be older, steadier, and far more thoroughly seasoned than the young officers fresh out of training, precisely because they had spent years learning the Navy from the deck plates up before they ever reached a cockpit. Everything about Dixon's path had shaped him into a practical, unflappable, deeply experienced seaman first, and an aviator second. When the aircraft failed, and the situation reverted to a raw test of seamanship and nerve, that background turned out to be exactly the one the moment demanded. The Navy had, almost by accident, put the right man in that raft. In the middle station sat the bombardier, Anthony Pastula, known as Tony, 24 years old, from Youngstown, Ohio. He was rated an aviation ordnanceman, a specialist in the aircraft's weapons. In the rear station, working the radio and the flexible gun, sat Gene Aldrich, 22, a country boy from Sikeston, in the boot heel of southeast Missouri, a young man raised close to the land, who knew how to hunt and how to wait. The three of them belonged to Torpedo Squadron 6, which flew from the aircraft carrier Enterprise, a ship destined to become the most decorated vessel in the entire United States Navy by the end of the war. On the 16th of January 1942, barely 5 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor had dragged the country into the fight, they were ordered aloft on a routine patrol, scouting the empty water ahead of the fleet for enemy submarines. It is worth pausing on that date, because the mood of it matters. 5 weeks. The wreckage at Pearl Harbor was still smoking in living memory. The Pacific Fleet's battleships lay on the harbor bottom. The carriers, which had survived only because they had been at sea on the day of the attack, were now the most precious ships the Navy owned, and the Enterprise was one of a tiny handful standing between the west coast of the United States and a Japanese Navy that had, so far, won everywhere it had fought. In those weeks, the American carriers were feeling their way into their first offensive moves of the war, covering convoys and preparing to strike enemy island bases. Every aircraft that went up into a war the United States was, at that moment, losing. Losing an aircrew was a routine tragedy in a season full of them. To grasp how dark that season truly was, it helps to look beyond the single carrier and take in the whole map of the Pacific in those weeks. In the space of little more than a month, the Japanese advance had rolled across an astonishing expanse of ocean and territory. The American garrison on Wake Island had fought hard and fallen just before Christmas. The great fortress of Singapore, long thought to be the anchor of British power in the Far East, was sliding toward the surrender that would come in February. American and Filipino troops in the Philippines were being pushed back into a losing fight on the Bataan Peninsula. Island after island, harbor after harbor, was passing into Japanese hands, and the enemy fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor still ranged the ocean essentially unbeaten. Against that tide, the American carriers were not yet winning battles. They were buying time and probing for the first opening. That was the war Dixon and his crew flew into on the 16th of January, and it is a large part of the reason the fleet could not spare so much as a single ship to look for them. The work these three men trained for was among the most dangerous in all of naval aviation. A torpedo bomber's job was to fly low and straight toward an enemy warship, holding a steady course through a storm of anti-aircraft fire in order to drop its torpedo close enough and true enough to strike home. In the final run, there was no dodging and no evasion. Success demanded that the crew fly directly into the guns and trust that they would come out the other side. It took a particular kind of nerve to make a living that way, and the men who crewed these aircraft understood exactly how exposed they were every time they attacked. That the three of them would end up fighting for their lives not over an enemy fleet, but alone against an empty ocean, did not change the temperament they brought to the fight. They were men conditioned to hold a steady course into danger and not turn away. That conditioning, as much as any single skill, is part of what would carry them through the month to come. Here the excellence of the machine collided with the first hard limit of the moment they were living in, and the limit won. The Enterprise and her escorting ships were operating under strict radio silence. A carrier at sea in early 1942 was a priceless and fragile thing, and the surest way to get one killed was to let it broadcast signals that enemy direction finders could catch and turn into a bearing and a torpedo. So the rule was absolute. Aircraft on patrol did not chatter on the radio. They flew their assigned box of ocean, they searched it, and they came home, and they kept quiet unless they found something worth breaking silence for. That single discipline sound and necessary for the survival of the ship, carried a hidden cost. It meant that when Dixon and his crew drifted off their navigation and could not find their way back, they could not simply key the radio and ask the fleet for a bearing home. To do so might hand the enemy the very carrier they had launched from. They got lost the way aircrews got lost in that era, through a chain of small, ordinary errors that no single man could be blamed for. Navigation over open water in 1942 was an art of estimation. A pilot held a compass heading, judged his speed, counted the minutes, and worked out on paper roughly where he ought to be. It was called dead reckoning, and it was only ever as good as the guesses fed into it. The wind aloft was not what they thought it was. Their heading and their timing produced a position that did not match the truth, and the carrier itself, as carriers must, had steamed on and maneuvered while they were away, so the patch of sea where they expected to find her was no longer the patch of sea she occupied. The light began to fail. Fuel, the one resource in aviation that cannot be argued with, drained down toward nothing, and somewhere over a stretch of the Pacific that held no islands, no ships, and no help of any kind, the engine of that modern torpedo bomber fell silent, and Harold Dixon had to put the aircraft down onto the open sea in the last of the daylight. He did it well. Ditching an aircraft into ocean swells is one of the most dangerous maneuvers a pilot can attempt. A controlled crash onto a surface that looks soft and is not, and Dixon set the Devastator down without killing any of the three of them. But the machine that had been so advanced on paper now became, in the space of about a minute, entirely useless to them. The Devastator was never built to float. It went down fast, nose first, and it took with it very nearly everything a human being needs to stay alive at sea. The emergency rations sank, the water sank, the first aid kit, the signaling gear, the flares, the pump, most of the small equipment that any survival plan depends upon, all of it followed the aircraft more than 3 miles, straight down to the floor of the Pacific. The men scrambled clear into a small rubber raft that had come free, and as they sat in the dark, catching their breath and taking stock, they discovered exactly how little the sea had allowed them to keep. They had the raft. They had the clothes on their backs. They had a pocket knife, a pair of pliers, a police whistle, a small can of rubber cement with some patching material for the raft, 2 life jackets, and a .45 caliber pistol with a few clips of ammunition. They had no food. They had no fresh water. They had no map, no working radio, no compass they could trust, no oars, no fishing tackle, and no way on earth to tell another living soul where they had gone into the water. 3 men, 1 small rubber boat, a handful of objects that would have fit into a coat pocket, adrift on the largest ocean on the planet. That was the entire inventory of their survival, and within days, even the pistol would corrode into a useless lump of salt-eaten metal. Now set that inventory against the thing that was supposed to save them, and did not yet exist in any form that could reach them. In January of 1942, American air-sea rescue was, to be blunt, barely even an idea. The war in the Pacific was 5 weeks old. The machinery of organized rescue that later flyers would come to count on had simply not been built yet. There were no squadrons of long-range flying boats assigned specifically to comb the sea for downed crews. There was no chain of rescue submarines stationed along the strike routes with standing orders to surface and take airmen aboard. There was no coordinated web of spotter aircraft and radio direction finding and fast rescue craft working together to turn a man in the water into a man on a deck within hours. All of that lay in the future, and every piece of it would be built, painfully and at great expense, precisely because of losses exactly like this one. And even if some fragment of that future system had existed on that January evening, it could not have helped these 3 men, for the simplest reason imaginable. Nobody knew where they were. They had gone down under radio silence, off their expected track, with no distress call sent and no position reported. To search for them, the Navy would have needed to guess correctly across many thousands of square miles of empty ocean, and then to pull ships and aircraft away from a shooting war to chase that guess, in the very waters where enemy submarines were hunting. The cold arithmetic of early 1942 did not allow it. The fleet logged them as missing, and the fleet, correctly and unavoidably, went back to fighting the war. So the telegram went out. This is the part of the story that reaches past the machinery of the war and into the front rooms of ordinary American homes. Because in the 1940s, the way a family learned that the war had taken one of theirs was almost always the same. A messenger from the telegraph company came up the walk with an envelope. In a small town, the messenger, and often the postmaster, already knew before the family did what that envelope contained, and dreaded the walk to the door. The message itself used a small set of stock phrases that an entire generation learned to fear. The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you. Missing. Lost. In households across the country, a small flag hung in the front window, a blue star on a white field for a son or husband away in the service. If the worst news came, the blue star was replaced by a gold one, and a gold star mother became a particular and terrible kind of American figure. Gene Aldrich's family, by the account his sister gave decades afterward, received one of these wires. Her brother, it said, was lost at sea. It is worth understanding the exact machinery of grief that the government operated in that war, because it explains why survival stories like this one strike so deep. The armed forces of the 1940s drew a careful and painful distinction between a man confirmed killed and a man merely missing. Missing meant unaccounted for. It meant probably dead, but not certainly, not yet. A family handed a missing notice entered a specific limbo that could last weeks, or months, or in some cases years, in which the person they loved was neither confirmed alive nor confirmed dead, but suspended somewhere the paperwork could not resolve. The law of the period eventually allowed the services to presume a missing man dead after a set period had passed with no evidence he lived, which meant families sometimes carried that uncertainty for a very long time. According to the recollection of Gene Aldrich's sister, their mother could not make herself accept the telegram and kept faith that her son was alive. Whether that faith took the shape the family later described, in the exact detail of letters written and mailed, is not something the official record can confirm. What is beyond dispute is the shape of the situation itself. A family in Missouri had been told the sea had taken their boy, and out on that same sea, the boy was not done yet. Multiply that single telegram by the scale of the war, and you begin to feel the weight the country was carrying. Before it was over, more than 400,000 Americans in uniform would die, and many hundreds of thousands more would be wounded or reported missing. The approach of a telegraph messenger became one of the most feared sights in American life. Whole streets learned to watch the messenger's walk, and to hold their breath until they saw which door he was making for. A blue star in a front window meant a household with someone away at the war. A gold star meant a household the war had already taken from. That was the vast and sorrowful backdrop against which a single reversal, one wire that turned out to be wrong in the best possible way, could feel very much like a miracle, not only to the family that received it, but to everyone who later heard the story. He and the two men with him had made a decision that their situation did not obviously justify. They had decided to live, and the manner in which they went about it turned that tiny raft into a kind of floating argument against everything the odds said should happen to them. Leadership fell naturally to Harold Dixon, the oldest of the three by nearly 20 years, and the only one with the depth of sea experience the moment demanded. 2 decades in the Navy had taught him to see the ocean not as a horror to panic over, but as a working environment with rules, and from the first hours he treated their predicament as a problem to be managed, one small task at a time, rather than a catastrophe to be mourned. He took charge of what little they had, which was almost nothing, and rationed it. He assigned roles and kept the 2 younger men occupied, because he understood a truth that experienced sailors carry in their bones. Despair is itself a cause of death at sea. A man who surrenders in his mind stops doing the small, constant, unglamorous work that survival demands, and once he stops, the sea finishes him quickly. The mind fails before the body does. Dixon's job, as he understood it, was to make sure none of the 3 of them stopped. By the account Dixon gave afterward, the 3 of them held on to the ordinary structures of life as deliberately as they held on to their ration of water. They kept a routine. They talked through the plan and the day ahead. They marked the passing of time so that the days did not dissolve into one endless present, which is one of the quiet ways the mind surrenders at sea. They drew on faith and on the simple discipline of a shared purpose to hold despair at arm's length. None of this appears in a decoration citation, and none of it can be weighed or measured, but the people who study survival at sea will tell you it is often the very thing that separates those who come home from those who do not. The body can endure a great deal. It tends to endure only as long as the mind keeps giving it a reason to. The most remarkable thing Dixon did across those weeks was navigate. He had no instruments, he had no chart, he had no compass he could rely on after the ditching. What he had was 20 years of accumulated seamanship and a set of natural signs that a trained sailor can still read when every instrument is gone. He watched the sun rise and set to fix east and west. He watched the stars wheel overhead through the tropical nights, reading direction from the patterns that hang over the Southern Ocean. He studied the wind and the long run of the swells. He tore small scraps of cloth loose and dropped them into the water alongside the raft, timing how they fell behind, so that he could estimate how fast they were drifting and in what direction. From these fragments of information, gathered day after day, he built and maintained a running estimate of their position. He worked it out with a stub of pencil against a small navigator's scale, and he sketched a rough chart on the back of one of the life jackets, updating it in the evenings. And from that estimate, he made a deliberate choice. He would drive the raft to the west, toward the scattered island groups of the South Pacific, where the odds of touching land, while long, were not zero. He steered deliberately away from the islands held by the enemy. Reading the sky the way Dixon read it is far harder than it sounds, and it is worth understanding what he was actually doing. In the northern hemisphere, a sailor can find the pole star and, through it, true north at a glance. In the waters south of the equator, there is no such convenient marker in the sky. Instead, a navigator learns to work from other patterns, above all the small bright constellation known as the Southern Cross, which points the way toward the southern pole of the heavens for anyone who knows how to line it up. By day, Dixon took his east and west from where the sun rose and set, and from the height of that sun at noon, he could make a rough guess at how far south they had drifted. None of this gave him a precise position on the ocean. All of it together, checked night after night against his scrap of a chart, gave him something almost as valuable. A steady, reliable sense of which way was west, and the confidence to keep driving the raft in that one direction across weeks when a lesser navigator would have wandered in circles until the sea closed over him. They had no proper oars, so they improvised. They fashioned crude paddles, and at times rigged a small makeshift sail from what little cloth they had, using the wind that Dixon read to push them in the direction he had chosen. This distinction matters, and it is easy to miss. They were not simply drifting and hoping. A powerless raft at the mercy of the current is a passive thing. What Dixon did was navigation, conducted by a man with no tools, sustained across more than a month, a continuous act of reading the sea and bending their path toward the one outcome that could save them. He was steering. He simply had almost nothing to steer with. Then there was the problem of water, which in an open boat is always the problem that kills first. A human being can endure a surprisingly long time without food and a very short time without fresh water, and the particular cruelty of the open ocean is that a man dying of thirst is surrounded on every side by an endless volume of water he must not drink. Seawater is a trap. Its salt content is high enough that swallowing it forces the body to expel more water than the drink provides, so that each mouthful accelerates the very dehydration it seems to relieve, driving a person faster toward delirium, kidney failure, and death than drinking nothing at all would. Shipwrecked men have died precisely because thirst broke their judgment, and they gave in and drank from the sea. Dixon knew this hard fact, and he held the line against it, enforcing on all three of them the discipline that kept them from that fatal mistake. Their water had to come from the sky, and so they turned themselves into instruments for catching rain. When squalls swept over them, and in that part of the Pacific the rain did come, they used their life jackets and every other surface they could to catch and hold the falling water, then drank what they had gathered, and hoarded whatever they could keep against the dry stretches in between. It was never enough to be comfortable. Thirst was a near-constant companion, but across many days it was, barely, enough to keep 3 men alive, and the timing of the rains became one more thing that stood between them and the end. Food came from the sea, and taking it was a war of its own. In the first days they had nothing, and hunger set in hard and deep. Then, slowly, they learned to take what the ocean grudgingly offered. Here the young Missourian, Gene Aldrich, became the crucial man. He was patient and quick, and steady-handed, a hunter by upbringing, and he became the Raft's fisherman. Within the first week he managed to spear a fish using the pocket knife, the first real food they had taken from the water. That same period, while the pistol still worked, an albatross settled close enough to the raft to be shot, and the great seabird became a meal at a moment they badly needed one. On another night, further along, Dixon managed to seize a tern that landed near his head in the dark. Every scrap of flesh was fought for, and nothing was wasted. What they caught, they shared out under Dixon's rationing, and it was never much, but it was the difference between wasting away and holding on. And then there were the sharks, which trailed the raft the way sharks trail anything wounded and adrift, circling a thin rubber boat that a large enough animal could have torn open without effort. On roughly the 8th day, the men found themselves in a genuine fight for their lives against one of them. A shark perhaps 4 feet long came within reach, and Aldrich, with extraordinary nerve, drove the pocket knife into it, and, together, they hauled the thrashing animal up out of the water and into the raft, a desperately dangerous thing to do in a boat that size. They killed it. They ate it, taking the liver first, having heard somewhere that it held nourishment they needed. That small, ordinary pocket knife, which had happened to ride out of the sinking aircraft in someone's pocket, had now caught them fish and killed a shark, and they guarded it as the treasure it had become. The sea did not confine its assaults to sharks and thirst. It threw weather at them. Across the weeks, storms rolled over the tiny raft, and more than once, at least 3 times by the fullest accounts, the wind and the waves flipped the boat completely, pitching all 3 men and their few possessions into the ocean. Each capsizing was a small catastrophe with the power to be a final one. They had to find one another in the water, right the raft, and drag themselves back aboard, weaker each time, and then take a bitter inventory of whatever the sea had stolen in the chaos. Piece by piece the storms robbed them. Gear went over the side and did not come back. Their clothing, soaked without pause in salt water, began to rot and tear away from bodies that were already burning and blistering under the equatorial sun. By the late stages of the ordeal, they had almost nothing left, hardly more than the raft itself, and their own steadily diminishing bodies. Consider, too, the sheer physical fact of the space they lived in. A raft of that size gives 3 grown men almost no room at all. There was no space to stretch out fully, no way for all 3 to lie down at once in any comfort, no dry corner anywhere, and no shade of any kind. They sat and crouched and leaned against one another in a few square feet of pitching rubber, hour after hour, day after day, their legs and backs cramping, salt water sloshing constantly around them, the sun overhead with nothing between it and their skin. The raft that had saved their lives by keeping them off the ocean floor was also, in every waking minute, a small instrument of misery. To endure it for a single day would test almost anyone. To endure it for 34 days, while slowly starving, is difficult even to picture from the safety of dry land. Those bodies were failing in the specific and predictable ways that the ocean fails a human body. The sun, hammering down from above and glaring up off the water, burned their exposed skin raw, and then, day after day, burned it again, past redness into something far worse. Constant immersion in salt water broke the skin down further, opening painful sores that could not heal in those conditions. Hunger stripped the muscle off them until the strong young Navy men who had climbed into that raft were reduced to gaunt, hollow-eyed figures with the strength drained almost entirely out of them. And the tropics, for all their heat by day, turned cold at night over open water, so that exhaustion, exposure, dehydration, salt, sun, and starvation all worked on them together, a slow grinding process that should, by any ordinary medical logic, have finished all three of them well before any rescue could arrive from a navy that was not even looking for them. The plain reality of the sea makes the point starkly. In that era, most men set adrift in the open ocean without supplies did not last anything close to a month. Many died within a handful of days, taken by thirst, or by exposure, or by the despair that led them to drink the seawater that finished them. A week adrift was a serious ordeal. 2 weeks was uncommon. 34 days, with no stored food at all, and no fresh water beyond what happened to fall from the sky, sat far out at the ragged edge of what human beings survived. The 3 men on that raft were not simply unlucky to be there. With every additional sunrise, they were achieving something that the overwhelming majority of people in their situation never managed to achieve at all. What kept them alive was not their equipment, because they had almost none of it left. It was the thing that lived in the space between the 3 of them. Dixon's steadiness held the group together and, quite literally, pointed it in a survivable direction. Aldrich's skill and patience fed them. Pastula endured alongside them and carried his share of the unending labor. And beneath all of it ran a shared refusal, held in common by 3 very different men from 3 different corners of the country, to lie down and let the ocean have them. There is a reason this story survived to be told, and it is not that the sea showed them any kindness. The sea showed them none. It is that the 3 of them proved, across more than a month, harder to kill than the sea had any reason to expect. The ordeal did not last the neat interval a headline might promise. It lasted longer. It ran on well past 3 weeks and kept going, past a full month, out to a span of 34 days on the open Pacific. That number is difficult to hold in the mind when you set it against the size of the raft. 34 days on a piece of rubber, about the dimensions of a small dining table. 34 sunrises, each one greeting men already thirsty, already starving, already burned, and each one demanding that they choose again to do the exhausting work of staying alive, with no promise that the effort would ever be repaid. As for how far they traveled, the record genuinely disagrees with itself, and honesty requires saying so plainly. The straight-line distance from where they ditched to where they made land was on the order of 450 to 500 miles. But a raft does not travel in a straight line. Pushed by wind and current and steered by hand, their actual winding path across the water was estimated at closer to 1,000 to 1,200 miles. Both figures describe the same voyage. One measures the gap between the 2 points. The other measures the road they actually traveled to cross it. What is not in doubt is the direction they drove that road. West, toward land, by design. On the 34th day that design paid off, though it very nearly did not. By this point the 3 of them were near the outer edge of what a human body can do, and the weather, which had tormented them for a month, now turned dangerous in a new way, as the winds ahead of a building tropical storm began to rise around the raft. Then, low on the horizon ahead, there was something that was not water. By the account that has come down to us, drawn from Dixon's own retelling afterward, it was Gene Aldrich, weak and half out of his mind with exhaustion, who saw it first, and who described it in the plain language of the Missouri farm country he had come from. He said it looked like a field of corn. It was not corn, it was the green of trees, standing up against the sky. It was land. After 34 days, the long westward push had carried them within reach of an island. The island was Pukapuka, a remote atoll near the northern edge of the Cook Islands, in the South Pacific. It was a fitting place for them to arrive, because European sailors had named that stretch of water the Danger Islands centuries earlier, for the treacherous reefs that ringed the low coral land and wrecked the ships that came too close. It lay far from the shipping lanes, administered from a great distance by New Zealand, and home to a community of Polynesian islanders living much as their ancestors had for generations. The final approach carried its own last danger. The waters around such an atoll are guarded by a barrier of coral, and a heavy surf breaking on that reef can smash a small boat to pieces and drown exhausted men within sight of the safety they have spent a month trying to reach. The raft, carrying the last of the strength of the 3 men in it, had to get across that barrier, and in the crossing, the sea flipped them one final time. But they made it through. On the 19th of February 1942, 34 days after they had fallen out of the sky, Harold Dixon, Gene Aldrich, and Anthony Pastula came up out of the Pacific Ocean and onto solid ground, alive. What met them there was human kindness, of the plainest and most essential kind. The islanders took the 3 ruined strangers in without hesitation. They fed them, gave them fresh water, tended their burned and broken skin and their wounds, and gave them the shelter and the rest that the sea had denied them for over a month. These were people of modest means, offering care to 3 men who had appeared out of the ocean at the very edge of death, and that care was the bridge between merely reaching land and actually surviving. How word of 3 lost Americans traveled from a tiny atoll all the way to the United States Navy is its own small window onto the Pacific War. Across the islands of the South Pacific, the Allies relied on a thin and scattered network of watchers. Some were colonial officials, others were traders or planters or missionaries, and many of them were equipped with little more than a radio set and a great deal of nerve. Their task was to report the movements of ships and aircraft and, when the chance came, to help downed or shipwrecked men. Remote as it was, Pukapuka was not entirely outside that web of eyes and radios. Once the islanders had the 3 men fed and mending, word of their survival could be passed along toward an authority with the power to act on it, and from there toward the fleet that had already written them off. It was a reminder that even at the furthest edge of the map, the war reached, and in this case, so did the rescue. Word was gotten out to American authorities that 3 Navy airmen, long since given up for lost, were alive on the atoll. In time, a ship was sent for them. The small seaplane tender Swan made the voyage out to the Danger Islands and carried the 3 of them back toward the fleet and the war they had fallen out of a month and a half earlier. Now the telegram machinery of the United States government had to run in reverse, and this is the moment the whole story has been building toward. Somewhere in Sikeston, Missouri, a family that had been told the sea had swallowed their boy learned that the sea had given him back. The lost had been found. The word on the wire had been wrong. The men who had flown off the edge of the map on the 16th of January came back onto the rolls of the living, and the families who had been handed the worst news the war could deliver were told, against every odd the situation had carried, that they could hope again, and then that they could celebrate. The Navy understood exactly what it had on its hands, both as a feat and as a gift to a frightened country. Harold Dixon, whose seamanship and steadiness had held 3 men together and steered a powerless raft across hundreds of miles of open ocean to land, was awarded the Navy Cross, one of the highest decorations the naval service can bestow. The citation, in the spare and formal language of such things, credited him with navigating the boat for 34 days over approximately 500 miles, without adequate provisions or equipment, and bringing his crew safely to land. The 2 younger men, Aldrich and Pastula, each received a letter of commendation for the courage and the strength of character they had shown across the same ordeal. When Gene Aldrich came home to Sikeston, the town turned out to receive him as what he plainly was, a young man who had come back from the dead, and made a hero's welcome of it. In the anxious opening months of a war, the country was not yet winning. The story of the 3 men on the raft became exactly the kind of account a shaken nation needed. Proof that an American serviceman could be knocked into the sea, stripped of everything, written off as gone, and still find a way to come home. The account did not remain a rumor or drift off into legend, and that matters for a reason worth stating plainly. It was written down carefully, close to the events, by a professional whose business was getting the facts right. A war correspondent named Robert Trumbull, who worked for a major American newspaper, took down Harold Dixon's account in detail and shaped it into a book, titled simply The Raft, which was published in 1942, while the war was still on and the memories were still fresh. It sold widely and reached a huge readership, and because of it, the specifics of those 34 days were preserved rather than left to blur into folklore. There is a limit worth acknowledging in that record, however. Trumbull built his book from Dixon's telling, and Dixon was the only one of the three he interviewed at length, so the fine-grained details of daily life on the raft, the exact words spoken and the order of events, all descend ultimately from one man's memory of a delirious, starving month. The broad strokes are corroborated by the physical evidence and by the reporting of the time. The small human textures rest on Dixon's word. The book found an enormous audience at exactly the moment the country most needed the encouragement it carried. It was chosen by a major book club and brought into hundreds of thousands of American homes, and the story of the three men on the raft was retold in newspapers and over the radio until it became one of the widely known survival tales of the early war. The raft itself was pressed into service as a kind of witness. For a time it was placed on public display where crowds could file past and see it, this small and unremarkable rubber boat that had done something so remarkable before it eventually came to rest in the museum where it sits today. In a war fought on a scale almost too vast to feel, there was something quietly powerful in a story, narrowed down to just 3 men, 1 boat, and the plain question of whether they would live. And there is physical evidence, which is more than most survival stories of that war can claim. The actual raft, the very rubber boat that carried 3 men across a month of open Pacific, was kept, and it survives to this day in the collection of the National Museum of Naval Aviation, where a visitor can stand in front of it and take the measure of 2 things at once: how small it is, and how large the ocean is. The decorations are real and are on the record. The book was written and read. This is not a sea tale that swelled in the retelling around a bar. It is a documented event, anchored by a book set down at the time, by formal military citations, and by an object you can still travel to and see with your own eyes. That same documentation lets us be honest about the parts that later retellings sometimes smoothed over, and that honesty is what separates history from myth. The distance the raft covered, as we have seen, is recorded inconsistently, and no one should state a single hard number as though it were settled. The story was, at various times, dramatized and tidied for effect, most visibly in a motion picture made decades later that took the true events as its starting point and then shaped them for the screen the way films always do, inventing conflicts and moments that never occurred. The facts do not need that shaping. 3 men, 1 small raft, 34 days, almost no supplies, a navigator working from the sun and the stars and scraps of falling cloth, a shark killed with a pocket knife, an island reached at the far end of a westward push that a dying man mistook for a field of corn. That is the true version, and it is stronger than any embellishment a screenwriter could bolt onto it. There is a quiet and unlikely detail that the years added afterward, the kind of thing no one could have scripted while the 3 of them lay burning in that raft. The bond forged among those men did not dissolve when they stepped back onto American soil. In the time that followed, the Aldrich and Pastula families became joined by marriage. Gene Aldrich married Tony Pastula's sister, and a sister of Aldrich's married a brother of Pastula's, so that 2 young men who had shared a rubber boat and a near death at the edge of the world ended up bound together as kin, their families braided into one. Whatever the ocean had tried to take from them, they came home and built families that were, in the most literal sense, tied to each other by those 34 days. It is a gentle ending to a violent story, and unlike the inventions of the film, it is true and it is on the record. Now step back from the raft and consider what the whole episode reveals, because the meaning of it sits a level above the adventure. The 3 men on that raft were saved by their own hands, and by the mercy of strangers on a remote island, and they were saved in that manner because, in January of 1942, there was no other rescue to be had. The navy that produced them was in most respects a superb fighting force, and the ship they had flown from would go on to earn more battle honors than any other American vessel of the war. But that same navy, in those first raw weeks, had a gap in it precisely the size and shape of 3 men lost at sea with no way to call for help. There was no system standing ready to find them. That was not negligence, and it was not incompetence. It was the honest limit of where military capability had reached at that early point in an enormous and still expanding war. What lifts this story above a single stroke of good fortune is that the gap did not stay open. The United States spent the rest of the war closing it, driven in no small part by losses exactly like this one. Over the following years, the Navy and the wider American war effort built the very capability that had been missing on the evening Harold Dixon put his aircraft into the sea. They stood up dedicated air-sea rescue operations, with aircraft assigned specifically to search for and recover downed crews. Long-range flying boats, the patrol planes the crews affectionately nicknamed Dumbos, were fitted out for rescue and sent to orbit near the scene of major strikes, ready to land on the water and pull men out of it, and formal rescue operations of that kind took hold through 1943. Even more striking was the rise of the submarine lifeguard, in which submarines were posted along the routes of carrier airstrikes, with the standing job of surfacing to take flyers aboard, a mission that grew from a novelty into a fixture of every major operation. By the end of the war, American submarines alone had rescued over 500 airmen from the sea. One of them, plucked from the Pacific near a Japanese-held island in the late summer of 1944 by the submarine Finback, was a young naval aviator named George Bush, who would live to become President of the United States. And alongside the aircraft and the submarines came better rafts, better rations sealed against the sea, better signaling gear, dye markers and mirrors and radios built to survive a ditching, and the training to use all of it, so that a later flyer in the water had a real and steadily improving chance of being found by his own side, rather than being left to steer by the stars and pray for an island. The change in a downed airman's odds over the course of the war was dramatic. Where Dixon's crew had gone into an ocean with no one at all looking for them, a carrier pilot 2 years later might hit the water already knowing that a rescue plane was circling nearby and a submarine was already turning toward his position. During a single major strike against an enemy base, one American submarine on lifeguard station pulled well over 20 airmen out of the sea across a few days of fighting. Rescue had been transformed from a matter of private endurance and blind chance into a matter of doctrine, planning, and dedicated machinery, backed by the full weight of an industrial nation at war. The men of the raft never had any part of that. Everything they lived through in the last stretch of the war before such help existed at all. Measured against that mature system, the survival of the 3 men of Torpedo Squadron 6 looks more extraordinary, not less, because they had literally none of it. They are the case that helps explain why the system had to exist. Every piece of rescue capability that a later airman could rely on was, in part, an answer to the problem these 3 men embodied when they went into the water uncounted and unlocated and were forced to become their own salvation. They did with bare human endurance what the machinery of a fully mobilized war effort would later do with aircraft and submarines and radios. They were the living proof of the need, 34 days of it, written in sunburn and salt sores on their own skin. There is a further, sharper irony folded into the machine they flew, one the 3 of them could not have known as they clawed their way west. The Douglas Devastator, so modern in 1937, was by 1942 an aircraft whose time had already passed. It was too slow and too vulnerable for the war it now had to fight. Less than 5 months after Dixon's crew made landfall, at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, squadrons of these same torpedo bombers flew almost straight into annihilation. Their old squadron and its sister squadrons pressed home their attacks at wave-top height and were cut to pieces by enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, with only a handful of the aircraft and their crews surviving the day. Of one entire squadron of these torpedo planes, every single aircraft was shot down, and only 1 airman lived, left floating alone in the middle of the battle to watch the rest of the fight unfold from the water. Their sacrifice was not wasted, because it pulled the enemy's defenses down low and helped clear the sky for the American dive bombers that broke the back of the Japanese carrier fleet in a matter of minutes. But the Devastator itself was finished. It was withdrawn from the front line almost immediately afterward. The aircraft that had failed to bring 3 men home in January was, within half a year, sending far more men than that to the bottom of the sea. Dixon and Aldrich and Pastula had, in a strange way, survived their machine. So hold the whole shape of it in your mind one last time. The United States Navy, following sound and necessary procedure, concluded that 3 of its men were lost, and it told their families so, because everything the Navy could see pointed to that conclusion, and because a fleet at war could not halt itself to prove the conclusion wrong. By the cold logic of fuel states and position reports and enforced radio silence, those men were gone. The conclusion was reasonable. It was also wrong. The men were alive the entire time the paperwork counted them among the dead. Alive on a raft, fighting the sharks and the thirst and the sun, steering by stars they could name toward a coastline none of them had ever seen. Between what the record said and what was true out on the water, there lay a gap 34 days wide, and 3 men lived inside it, and then walked out the far end of it onto a beach. That is the real center of this story, and it is the thing worth carrying away from it. A military machine, however good, runs on information, and information in 1942 had hard limits that no amount of courage at headquarters could overcome. Where the information ran out, these 3 men did not. A telegram in Missouri said the sea had won. The sea had not won. It had merely not yet finished, and neither had they. And in the end it was Harold Dixon's 20 years of seamanship, and Gene Aldrich's steady hunter's hands, and Tony Pastula's refusal to quit, and the plain generosity of a people on a far-off atoll, that turned the worst wire a mother could receive into the rarest thing the war ever sent back. A correction. Her son was not lost. He was only late.